On February 12, 1487, the final chapter of Elizabeth Woodville's life began. Just one day after the birthday of her daughter, Elizabeth of York, she left the royal court and registered as boarder at Bermondsey Abbey. Like nearly every phase in the life of the mother of the princes in the Tower, this one is shrouded in controversy. Soon afterwards, the so-called Lambert Simnel Rebellion erupted. About 3 months later, Henry VII confiscated her estates and transferred them to his wife, Elizabeth of York. Ever since, historians have debated whether Elizabeth's move was voluntary or whether it was, in truth, a forced relocation. Let us examine what the contemporary sources reveal. Welcome back to Lemmy History. I have already explored the question of whether Elizabeth Woodville supported Simnel and whether he was, or might possibly have been, her son Edward. My answer in both cases was an emphatic no. I have linked that video in the description, so those interested can follow my arguments. I will not repeat them here. Instead, I will focus primarily on the move and the estates. I will present my own conclusion at the end of the video, but as a small spoiler. I am not entirely certain myself. I have only a leaning in one direction. The matter is far more complex than it first appears. Even within the Ricardian camp, there are prominent voices, among them Anne Sutton and Livia Visser-Fuchs, who believe her move was voluntary. The sources of the time can easily lead to a misleading conclusion. Because Elizabeth Woodville's move to the monastery grounds occurred in close proximity to the transfer of her property to her daughter, these two events are traditionally presented as being directly connected. Yet the contemporary records themselves do not actually support such a link. I now display Henry's instruction for the transfer of property, dated May 1st, 1487. It is clear that the move is not mentioned. Henry explicitly transfers the estates to his wife, specifying that payments are to be made directly to her or to those she authorizes to receive them. No motive for this action is given in the document. Only one source, dating at least from the early Tudor period, provides us with an explicit motive. This is Polydore Virgil, who writes, "Among other matters, Elizabeth, the widow of King Edward, was deprived by the decree of the same council of all her possessions. This was done because she had made her peace with King Richard, had placed her daughters at his disposal, and had, by leaving sanctuary, broken her promise to those, mainly of the nobility, who had, at her own most urgent entreaty, forsaken their own English property and fled to Henry in Brittany, the latter having pledged himself to marry her elder daughter Elizabeth." The move itself is not mentioned in Virgil's account. Instead, he attributes the confiscation of Elizabeth's property to her agreement with Richard III in 1484. His words were written 26 years after the transfer of ownership, and they contain a notable inaccuracy. It was not a council decree, but a direct order from the king. It is possible, however, that Virgil was referring to an entry in Henry's account books dated April 30th, 1487, which, along with others, bears the Great Seal of England for confirmation. This record states, "To the Queen, for the payment of all income and proceeds from all the lands, honours and castles that recently belonged to Elizabeth, the widow of Edward IV." Here again, we find no reference to her move, nor is Richard's name mentioned. We know of Elizabeth's relocation because she rented a house on the monastery grounds from the abbot on July 10th, 1486, for a period of 40 years and, as mentioned, she registered as a boarder on February 12th, 1487. Moreover, the sources occasionally note her presence as a guest at the royal court. Her daughters were free to visit her, and they took advantage of that opportunity. Henry himself continued to address her warmly as his dear mother-in-law. This raises the question of whether we have been linking together events that, in truth, do not belong together. It is entirely possible that the transfer of ownership from the old queen to the new had nothing whatsoever to do with Elizabeth's move. In my view, this is especially supported by the fact that Elizabeth Woodville had rented her house on the Abbey grounds more than half a year earlier. Not long after, she stood as godmother to her first grandson, Arthur, an honour Henry could easily have bestowed upon his own mother, Margaret Beaufort, without attracting attention, had he wished to do so. It is therefore conceivable that Elizabeth Woodville had intended all along to move to the Abbey property and live there on the income from her estates. If there was a punishment, it lay in the loss of those estates to her daughter. This is underscored by the fact that Elizabeth was not granted a fixed pension when she resettled. After losing her properties, she received only 400 marks a year, about £266, which was raised to £400 in 1490. Around this same period, Henry was even considering proposing Elizabeth Woodville as a bride for King James III of Scotland. The plan came to nothing when James died in 1488. This interpretation also explains why Elizabeth continued to be welcome at court. The loss of her estates had effectively neutralized her as a political force, making her entirely dependent on the king and her family for financial support. Yet the fact that the notion of punishment appears only 26 years later casts doubt on the idea. Moreover, the single source that offers such an explanation is so implausible that it is generally disregarded today. After all, Henry had known of Elizabeth's agreement with Richard III since 1484. So why would he have restored her estates to her in the year 1486 in the first place? Modern historians tend to advance two main alternatives. Either Elizabeth's estates were taken from her because of suspected support for Simnel, with the court avoiding any open acknowledgement of this, or the transfer was not a punishment at all, but the standard passing of the widow's properties from one queen to her successor, perhaps even with the consent and blessing of Edward IV's widow herself. The records closest to the events best support this second view. It was not retribution, but a relatively routine procedure. England had never before had two queens dowager at the same time, and Elizabeth Woodville was no longer queen. It is important to remember that this was a special situation. Normally, a queen's mother did not reside in England, as the king married a foreign princess. Edward IV and Henry VII broke with this pattern by marrying mother and daughter in succession. Elizabeth of York was intended to become Queen of France, and therefore had no real need for extensive estates in England for her upkeep. Elizabeth Woodville, for her part, lacked the backing of a foreign royal house that might have provided a generous dowry for her care. Nevertheless, it is difficult to dismiss Virgil's claim outright, that it was Elizabeth's agreement with Richard that cost her the loss of her estates. It remains possible that Henry VII simply changed his mind, at first forgiving his mother-in-law, only to find, later, that his anger got the better of him. The Simnel Rebellion may also have played an indirect role. The issue may not have been whether Elizabeth Woodville actively supported Simnel, but rather the king's fear that she might. This uprising was led by some of the most steadfast supporters of Richard III. His heir, John de la Pole, and his closest friend, Sir Francis Lovell, were among the leading figures, joined by Richard's sister, Margaret of York. These names may well have stirred unwelcome memories for Henry, recalling the spring of 1484, when Elizabeth suddenly placed her daughters in Richard's custody, seemingly breaking her alliance with the Tudors. The brief imprisonment of her remaining son, Thomas Grey, who had attempted to leave Henry's service and return to England, would also fit into this picture. Of course, none of this can be proven with certainty. We cannot look into Henry's mind. All we can do is construct the most plausible interpretation possible from the evidence that survives. This brings me to my own interpretation of the events. If the transfer of ownership from mother to daughter was intended as a punishment, then I believe it was separate from the matter of Elizabeth's move. Had the two been connected, there would have been no reason not to mention them together. Combined with the fact that Elizabeth had rented her house more than half a year earlier, my conclusion is this: she wished to live on the monastery grounds, nor was she the first queen to choose this particular convent. Another point often overshadowed by the many accusations of witchcraft made against her is that Elizabeth Woodville was a deeply devout woman. Such a decision suited her nature. She had restored her family's reputation. Her daughter now sat upon the throne, and her grandson, her godchild, stood to inherit the crown. It is entirely plausible that she felt she had fulfilled her duties. As for the transfer of ownership, I do not believe it constituted a punishment in the literal sense. If it had truly been a consequence of her agreement with Richard, Henry could have transferred the estates to his wife as early as 1486. But he did not. A punishment would also imply that Elizabeth had committed some offense, yet we have no source to support such a charge, nor did Henry treat her as though she were guilty. The only scenario in which I could interpret it as a kind of punishment is if Henry's paranoia took hold during the Simnel Rebellion, led by Richard's supporters. Even then, he clearly had enough trust in his wife, Elizabeth Woodville's daughter, to believe she would not betray him. To me, the most plausible explanation is that the time for this change had simply arrived. Elizabeth of York had been queen for more than a year, was the mother of the crown prince, and her own coronation was only months away. The Pope had recognized her as Edward IV's heir, and she was already actively engaged in arranging marriages for her sisters. Notably, Henry did not seize the estates of Cecily Neville at this time, even though she was the grandmother of John de la Pole. The difficulty with my interpretation lies in Virgil's account, which contradicts it. In historical scholarship, this is sometimes referred to as the veto of the sources. We have only one testimony that offers a motive. While Henry's instruction for the transfer does not mention Richard, he also does not contradict Virgil's statement. As a result, my interpretation, and likewise the idea that it was a punishment for Simnel, stands at odds with the written record. It would be easy to follow Okerlund in dismissing Virgil's statement as wrong, but I have no definitive evidence to do so. That is why I leave this question open. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to support the channel.